In the back of Macon's celebrated Rose Hill Cemetery is the overgrown plot of the John Birch family. And I wanted to come here to tell the story of Brother John Birch himself. And basically I wanted to dispel the commonly told myth, the one you'll read on Wikipedia, and the one which the government has propagated for decades. Now, the government's official line is to deny, downplay, and ignore. The government's official narrative, I believe, is that he was just going to accept the surrenders of Japanese officers at an airfield up in that province, and that he wasn't investigating the communists at all. But no, you're saying that's a total lie.
That's not right at all. He knew what was going on. Well, we got writings from him where he talked about these are communists at work, knowing this. He knew it was a communist movement. His big question is who and why in our government was promoting Mao Zedong and why. He asked questions about it. He was a sharp guy.
Shanghai has fallen to Japan. Before the final terrific onslaught of Japan's mechanized army, China is forced to withdraw beyond the Suchao Creek, and Japan's army commander controls all the native sections of the world's 6th largest city. These pictures show the final street-to-street and hand-to-hand battle, the house-to-house advance behind a smoke screen, with tanks snorting ahead through the narrow streets.
On December 7th, 1941, Japan, like its infamous Axis partners, struck first and declared war afterwards. America lost 3 destroyers. Here are seen the United States destroyers Downs and Shaw as they rest on the bottom of Pearl Harbor with decks awash after Jap bombers make direct hits on their decks.
The planes sweep in without being discovered. They separate into groups to attack the several objectives carefully selected by means of accurate intelligence to ensure that only targets of military value will be hit. Colonel Doolittle himself has told of flying over the Emperor's palace and refraining from bombing it, though he could have left it in ruins. Later in China, the flyers who bailed out safely are decorated by Madame Chiang Kai-shek. The smiling Jimmy Doolittle does not yet know the fate of some of his comrades.
So what they devised, they took every plane they could, loaded it with what they could on bombs and ammunition to fly into China and to try to stop the Japanese. That was the overall plan. And General Chennault and Doolittle more or less were the driving forces of that. Now I'm going to tell you something a little more interesting about it. It's what you belong to today, the John Birch Society. John Birch is from Macon, Georgia. He grew up in a Christian family and followed in his dad was a pastor, and he followed in his dad's footsteps of becoming a pastor himself. When he was going to school in Macon to become a pastor, he got crosswise on with the seminary down there with some of the liberals that were moving in there, and got arguing with them. And it created quite a controversy down there. You can probably dig in the papers and find out some of the controversy on it. But then he said, "Okay, I'm not going to get my degree here." He went to Fort Worth Baptist Seminary.
I am eager to hear a little bit more, because I read it. John Birch seemed like he looked back at suing his teachers for heresy, and he kind of laughed at it. He said that he was a little zealous.
Well, he was young and smart. But I think also was part of just reading some of his writings is that he realized that he was going to lose education time just arguing with these people to the goal that he wanted to do. So he transferred to the Bible Baptist Seminary in Fort Worth, finished 2 years of college in 1 year's time, and that boggled my mind and then went on to the military from then.
John Birch was a missionary who found himself in China at the beginning of World War II. When Pearl Harbor was attacked, he jumped out his back window as Japanese soldiers burst in through his quarters in Shanghai, and he hiked 200 miles to free China, where he worked with General Claire Chennault, and he was an OSS operative, or in some ways attached to the OSS.
General Claire Chennault and a couple of other generals got to know him, and they were very impressed by his knowledge and how intelligent he was. So they asked him, they said, "You know, we have a lot of missionaries. We need intelligence people. Would you be willing in the country you're going to be working in will be our eyes and ears, which meant China, behind the scene. Despite this is when Japan was attacking China. Despite our forces were in there, but particularly despite the Chinese troop movements and everything, because they didn't know how deadly the Chinese were. They knew that Mao Zedong and the Communist Chinese were trying to overthrow the present government in there. As that was developing, our news media was telling people something different about Mao Zedong. He was the agrarian reformer. He was the future of China. We should support him. He'd be the new hope for China and everything. They had turned against Chiang Kai-shek, and the media was saying one thing. Our military was seeing a communist military takeover taking place as they were trying to fight Japan and China too. And they said, what the heck's going on? And I mean, if you want to really dig into this, go back in the early 40s, 41, 42, right in there, 43. Read Life magazine, Look magazine, Time, and you'll see these glowing articles in there about how we need to support them. And whoa, when I saw that, and I said, man, this is more than political. There's something else going on inside our government. And John Birch, because of his, he was a captain, missionary. They wanted him to do intelligence work for the military, and he agreed to do the intelligence work, but he says, I'm a missionary first. And so he, through his missionary outreach with everyday people, Christian organizations and Christian churches and everything, he got built up a pretty strong network of people throughout the whole area in China. And so he told them, if you see any Japanese troop movements or supply movements, get the information back to me right away, which they did. He passed it on to our leadership there in China, Chenault and Doolittle, and in many, many cases we were able to stop or interrupt the Japanese movements, because here they were moving into an area. We found out about it, got there before they did, and stopped them. And Japan never, at first, could not figure out how do we know this? But it was the farmer working in the field, the housewife gathering eggs. They were the ones collecting the information through John Birch and getting it back. He had, from what I understand, he had a tremendous intelligence operation built up there in the grassroots, working for him there. But one day, as this was going on, John Birch was sitting in a restaurant, eating, and I guess you call him a farmer, Chinese farmer, came up to him and whispered to him, I need to talk to you outside. He got up and went outside, and he said, we got a report down that there's a plane, one of your planes down, and explained where it is. And there may be some people who need some help. So apparently the plane had crash landed. Mm-hmm. So they went and found it, and found the people. They all survived. One of them was Doolittle himself. Mm-hmm. He brought Doolittle back, brought him back to base so he could continue the operation up there. And Doolittle was so impressed with John Birch that he asked John if he would be an intelligence. He says, the way you're working with the Chinese people and the network you've set up and the information we're getting back, we'd like you to be in our intelligence network. And John said, well, I'll help, but I'm a pastor. I'm a missionary.
And basically, the story is that after the war had ended, it was August 15th, 1945, and Japanese soldiers were naturally very reluctant to surrender to the Chinese, and so they were surrendering to Americans or to the Chinese nationalists. And John Birch, working with the OSS, Lieutenant Tung, and a few people in the Army, they were out on a mission. And their mission was to go north along the rail lines. And the official government narrative is that they encountered several camps of Chinese communists, and John Birch, who was himself a very conservative Christian man who preferred to think of himself as a missionary or as a chaplain than as a captain in the OSS, he encountered these communists and they said, surrender your weapons. Well, at the time, the Chinese communists were sort of shaky allies, sort of like the Stalinists immediately after World War II. And so Birch said, absolutely not. I will not turn over my guns. And there was a minor argument, and they went north along the railroad, and the Chinese must have communicated via their radio, because when he arrived there, the Chinese officer that was in charge of that camp, they had cleared the village, they had burned it down, he said, "John Birch, I want you and I want Lieutenant Tong, who is sort of his basically attaché in the local area. You're my prisoner. The rest of your GIs can go." I believe it was 5 GIs. They walked away and they heard the sound of shots. John Birch had been riddled with gunfire, and Lieutenant Tong had been hacked nearly to death with a machete. But all of the locals in the area knew John Birch, as you'll find out as I go forward with this documentary, because I'm interviewing people who actually knew his parents. Everybody knew John Birch, and when they saw his body lying in a ditch, they went to go dig it up, and they found Lieutenant Tong was still somehow barely alive, hacked to pieces with machetes.
It got to the point with our military forces, they were saying, well, who is this Mao Zedong? Was he friend or foe? So they formed a squad of men, and because of John Birch's knowledge, being over there for a few years, they asked him to go with that squad and intercept Mao Zedong and his forces, and just find out who these people are.
Have the rest of those men who survived ever come forward?
Only one survived, and that's why we know the story. What happened was they intercepted Mao Zedong and his forces. There was a lot of anguish, bad language, and talking back and forth, and nobody would answer questions. And finally, they asked, the communists got brazen, and they, under gunpoint, they asked for everybody's identification, and they captured the squad. That's what they did, and because they were badly outnumbered. And one of them was John Birch. And when they saw John Birch, they separated him from the group. And there was a lot of talk. They lined up the squad, shot them all. But after they shot John Birch, they literally bayoneted his body to pieces. So that's how Mr. Welsh found out about this story. Now, here the worst part was coming up next. The government would not tell Mr. and Mrs. George Birch what happened to John. They would not release any files. Verbally, they wouldn't say anything other than maybe he's missing. We'll let you know we find it something very general like that. And it took a conservative senator from California, I believe his name was Nolan, and a couple of conservative congressmen, and Mr. Welsh at that time was head of the National Manufacturers Association, heard about it too. And they went to work, they finally got the truth out, how John Birch was killed and why. And of course what we know from history after that, Mao Zedong did take over China.
And so the story eventually got out, thanks in no small part to John Birch's mother just tirelessly hounding these OSS officers and generals and demanding the true story come out. At the time, for a very short period of time, it was acknowledged that John Birch was the first casualty of the Cold War, and officers that were over him actually offered the Medal of Honor. They offered all of these medals, and they just vaporized into thin air as the John Birch Society was founded in his name. Now, I've spoken to people about the statements of the officers like Claire Chenot, and especially Doolittle, who worked with John Birch, who said, oh, John Birch would have disapproved of the society. Now, I want to go into his real story. I want to go what he was doing in China and who he was working for and the background of John Birch and what he had done in Macon, because Macon, I like to think as a Georgian, was sort of his hometown by birth. I'm curious if you could tell me a little bit, because you said you knew his father. And one thing I'm really eager to hear from you, apparently Doolittle said John Birch wouldn't have supported the John Birch Society, but you knew his father. And
his father and Mr. Welsh, to found the John Birch Society, were very good friends. And just to be around them, the way they kidded each other, it was hilarious.
But you think John Birch would have absolutely loved what the society's doing?
I think, yeah, I really do, because it was taught by his parents, too.
You ready? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you, Mr. Ray, for our republic.